Welcome. One of the things I just decided to do is discuss this prosperity gospel preacher um, situation that has been going on for a few years now. And something that I just dug up that I'm not even sure that the media will properly do is many of these for-profit ministers are either not educated in the right field to actually be credible sources of information when it comes to ministry, or they have gotten their education from a substandard, under par religious college. A good example, Kenneth Copeland. His only college degree comes from the substandard, under par, Oral Roberts University. But then you have Jesse Duplantis, which is even worse in that he has no college education, period. Which gives a very strong concern when the people disputing these claims have degrees like doctorates, PhDs from places like Talbot School of Ministry, which is part of Biola, which is a long-standing, high-quality university out here in California, or Dr. D. James Kennedy, whose education came from a seminary out there in Florida that has been long-standing for generations, high quality, and even people like Right Reverend Edward S. Little II, who is a graduate of the long-standing Seabury Western Theological Seminary out in the Chicago area. So why are these heavily qualified men disputing theological claims by the undereducated ministers not being listened to? Simply, the people who are in these congregations or watching the TVs aren't interested in quality teaching anymore. The Bible talks about preachers being there to tickle their ears. They are sitting in their own judgment. Now, for those of you who may not know why I'm talking about this, I have experienced some of this myself with people, both in YouTube comments and in personal interactions, on things that I was very disappointed about. Now, it's not because I dislike these people that I had arguments with them, but it's because I feel, excuse me, that if you have the right information and the right education to appropriately teach something, you are less likely to go and twist it into some strange phenomenon that's not even close to what it was meant to be. It has happened, but it is less likely. The undereducated high school level education may twist something from the redemptive quality of coming to the Lord into the, oh, you need to follow me or you're damned bit. That has happened 4 or 5 times already. That in ways that have caused catastrophic destruction and loss of life. Then you have the one weirdo out in history, in American history, that was heavily educated, that went to wackadoo. Bishop James T. Pike. But he did not lead people to death. That is a very big descriptor difference. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is kind of trying to be a gentle warning to those who put their whole faith in somebody like Joel Osteen, Benny Hinn, Joyce Meyer, or did I say Kenneth Copeland? Jesse Duplantis. They are not concerned about your spiritual well-being. They are not concerned about you. I can tell you that there are ministers who do appear on TV that are concerned about you from experience. They may not have the same media reach as Benny Hinn or so has, but they are out there. I had worked behind the scenes with one startup that has a large Arabic language broadcast ministry, along with the large English language broadcast. And I have to say, all of us as a team behind the scenes, we were genuinely interested in your prayer, your prayer needs. In fact, one of the interesting things about that broadcast that is majorly different than the vast majority of television broadcast ministries is there's no such gimmick to garner money. They line item it in the church budget. So the church that broadcasts this is actually paying the fees and so forth to have it on the air. And for those of you who want to know about that broadcast ministry, I will have its website in the description. But not all TV ministries are created equal. The ones that motivate you or talk about you gaining wealth or so forth, that's basically a Tony Robbins in a Christian costume. That is not what Jesus preached. Jesus preached, you will have a life of suffering, you will have struggles, but He will be with you in the midst of those. Not that you will get out of them. Getting out of them is kind of a big malarkey move that I feel creates, in the long term, a distrust of Christianity when things do not turn out the way you are hoping they will. Which is another reason why I'm very concerned with this. So if you're here and you're watching this, I only have one simple request for you. If you are a donor of a Benny Hinn, Joel Osteen, Kenneth Copeland, Rod Parsley even, I would ask that you would consider redirecting those funds to ministries who actually want to do a greater good. Ministries like In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley, Turning Point with Dr. David Jeremiah, or even Today's Walk with Roger Spradlin. I'm sorry, I had to remember the name of the broadcast ministry. And in the video, you will actually get a clip example of the ministry I'm talking about that's paid for exclusively by the church budget. I will add that in here. I do thank you for your time watching, and have a nice day.
Coming up on Today's Walk.
We are to accept the one who has wronged us as a partner. Love always finds a way to forgive. That's the miracle of grace. Forgiveness can take place.
It's Today's Walk from Valley Baptist Church.
Hi, I'm Roger Spradlin. Welcome to Today's Walk. We're going to conclude today our series of messages that I've entitled Mending Broken Relationships. We did these messages over the Christmas holidays here at Valley. They come right out of the New Testament book of Philemon. If we're not careful, we look at a book like Philemon that was written in the first century in the context of Roman slavery, and we ask ourselves, how could this possibly be relevant to modern life? But the book is about healing broken relationships. What could be more relevant than that? Join me today for this final message as we look at how God healed a broken relationship between two men. The greatest sermon that Jesus ever preached that we have recorded for us is the Sermon on the Mount. And it begins that great sermon with what we call the Beatitudes, the attitudes we are to be, we might say. He describes these blessings. Blessed are ye if you do this or if you're like that. Blessed or happy. And one of the things he says, blessed are the meek. Now, we don't think of meek as being something that we want to be. We think meekness and weakness, that's a little too close for comfort for us. But he said, blessed are the meek. Now, in the Old Testament, the Bible says about Moses that he was the meekest man in all of the earth. Now, we don't think of that. We think of Moses as this great prophet and this dynamic leader, but God's assessment was he was the meekest man in all the earth. That's kind of a parenthetical statement by the Holy Spirit. He's the meekest man in all of the earth. You know what the context of that verse is? It's in the book of Numbers. It was on the occasion of Moses being hurt. And he had seemingly the right to retaliate, but he didn't. He had the right to take vengeance, but he didn't. And when he did not retaliate for the wrong that was committed against him, the Bible says he was the meekest man in all of the earth. Jesus, it was said of him that he was meek and lowly. Meek? He's the very Son of God. He has the power in his fingertips to heal people and to raise the dead, and yet he was said that he was meek. You know, there was an occasion where Jesus certainly had the chance to retaliate, wasn't there? He was crucified. He was accused unjustly. They beat him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They compelled him to carry a cross. They took him outside of the city of Jerusalem. They drove spikes into his hands and his feet. There were the Pharisees standing there in the crowd that had chanted, "Crucify him, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. We have no king but Caesar," they cried. There was the Roman soldiers that stood there. There's the man that still held the bloody mallet in his hand. And Jesus spoke. And what did he say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If anyone had the right of retaliation, it was him. He had been unjustly accused, unjustly tried, unjustly sentenced, unjustly punished. If anyone had the right of vengeance, it would be Jesus. And yet he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He had the power. He's God. He could have called 10,000 angels with his thoughts, 10,000 times 10,000, wiped out humanity for eternity. But he didn't, because he was meek and lowly. He did not retaliate. He goes on in the Sermon on the Mount and says some wonderful things. Look what he says in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That's the law. That's really, when you think about it, the basis for law today. That's the basis for civilization. That there is justice in the world. That there is punishment. You take someone's life, you might forfeit your life. You say, well, we don't really practice this. You know, if someone pokes at your eye, you don't go to the judge and they hold the guy and let you poke out their eye. No, we assign a monetary value to it. And so there's litigation. And we assign a value to that tooth that they knocked out, and they have to pay for it. They have to pay for the eye. But sometimes they have to pay with their life in capital punishment. That's the basis of civilization. And he said, you've heard that. That's the law. That's civilization. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. He said there is the law with all of its demands of retaliation and rights. But he says, I tell you, don't exercise those rights. Someone wants to sue you, let him have your cloak also. And then there's another verse there in that same context that says, if they compel you to go 1 mile, go the second mile. We bring that into English as an idiom, you know, of going the second mile, which is a pretty lonely mile because it's not very well traveled, is it? But it's based in a Roman law. At that time, if a soldier is carrying a heavy backpack or his armor or something, if he comes across someone that is a slave or someone that's just part of a conquered people, they're not really a Roman citizen, he could by law compel you to carry his belongings for a mile. But he couldn't compel you to go beyond that. And so the Jews, they were ingenious. They put mile markers. They put a little marker at every mile. And so they watched where they were at all the time, and Roman soldiers said, hey, you carry my pack. You would carry it. When you got to that mile marker, you just set it down. You said, that's it. I'm through. You can make me carry it 1 mile, but you can't make me carry it 2. Jesus said, if someone compels you to go 1 mile, then you go the second. Go beyond what the law says and how you relate to other people. Listen to what he says in verse 42 in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5. Give to whom asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. Isn't that an amazing illustration? Did you catch the illustration? The illustration is of 2 farmers. He said there's a good man, a just man. He's a good man in the community. He's good to his wife, good to his children. He's just a good man. And then there's another farmer over here that is a vile man. He's an evil man. He is a wicked man. Now, if you were God, what would you do with those 2 farmers? You would send rain upon the crops of the good farmer. Well, what about the evil farmer, the vile man? You would probably send a drought if you were God. Then you would throw a few grasshoppers in just for good measure, you know, to eat up his crops. But that's not what God does. God says, I send the rain on the just and the unjust. Now, what if you were God, which is a good thing that you're not, but what if you were God, how would you treat those who have wronged you? Would you retaliate? Would you exact vengeance upon those who killed your son? Would you respond with the law, the demands of rights? Or would you respond to the wounds of life with love? That's the point of Philemon. There's several principles here. Principle number 1 is this: love finds a way to forgive. It always does. Love always finds a way. We think, well, I just can't forgive this person. I can't let go. Love always finds a way. In 1985, the National Law Review carried a story of the marriage of a man by the name of Russell Tetzlaff. He was a Wisconsin man that married his beloved over the telephone. It's an unusual wedding ceremony. And the reason they were married over the telephone is because the state would not lift a no-contact order forbidding them to see one another. You see, Russell Tetzlaff was on probation. And in a quarrel with his fiancée, she had accused him of assaulting her. And because of that, there was a restraining order against him. And so they reconciled, and they decided they wanted to get married, but it was kind of a hard-nosed judge, and he said, I'm not going to lift the restraining order. And so they couldn't have any contact with one another, so they decided to get married over the telephone. Now, after they said their vows, I guess they just hung up. I don't know. I don't know what happened after that. And they went their separate ways, I guess. I don't know. But you know what? That's love. Love always finds a way to forgive. Jesus was asked the question by Peter one day. Peter said, Jesus, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? 7 times. You know what? When you read that, I think Peter was showing off a little bit. You see, the wisdom of the rabbis of that day was that you forgive someone 3 times. That's all the obligation that you have. They offend you and they say, oh, I'm sorry, you forgive them. They do it again and they say, I'm sorry, and you forgive them. They do it again and you say, they say, oh, I'm sorry, and you forgive them. They do it the next time, you go, no, that's it, 3 times, 3 strikes, you're out. And so Peter is going beyond the wisdom of his day and says, 7 times? And Jesus said, no. 70 times 7. Your brother offends you and repents, you forgive them. Now, this is not a math issue. It's not that you add it up and 409 times you say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to write down every time and you're at 489, buddy. You better not mess up because I'm out of here after one more time. That's not what it is. The point is that love finds a way to be gracious. Grace makes us gracious, doesn't it? Here's another principle. Forgiveness involves a debt being settled. Look in Philemon, verse 18. But if he has wronged you or owes anything, put that on my account. If he has wronged you, well, obviously he's wronged him. He ran away. If he owes anything, well, where did he get the money to get all the way to Rome? Yeah, he owes. Put that on my tab. That's what Paul says. You ever had the experience you're sitting in a restaurant and the waitress comes at the end of the meal and says, someone's paid your bill. Someone saw you that knew you and paid your bill for you. It's a pretty nice experience. Put that on my tab. That's what Paul says. If he owes you, and you know what? The implication is he does. It's a first-class conditional sentence, which doesn't mean anything to you, but in the original language of the New Testament, that means that if this is true, and we assume it is true. In fact, many times a first-class conditional sentence is not translated if, but since. Since he owes you. William Barclay, in commenting on this passage, says that Christianity never allows for the default on a debt. A debt always has to be paid. Someone has to pay when there's a debt. And sometimes we have this goal that we want the other person to always be the one that pays. Philemon had been robbed by Onesimus, but money was gone. I don't know what he took. Maybe he stole some jewelry. Maybe he stole some clothing, some gold. He thought, boy, if I could just have this, I would be happy. And he took it. But he was still miserable inside until he met the Lord Jesus. And sometimes we think, oh, if I just had this possession, if I could just achieve this, if I just had that, I would be happy. But when you have broken relationships, you're going to be miserable in life. A broken relationship creates a debt. And this debt must be settled. Here's the issue. Who's going to pay? There's a broken relationship, so now there's a debt. Who's going to pay? We want to make the one who wronged us, make them pay, exact vengeance upon them. Sometimes it's passive. We say, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Sometimes it's active. We in their face, but we want them to pay. But you know what? The one who is wrong isn't always the one that pays. That's what forgiveness is about. It's about being the one who pays. Onesimus carried this letter along with Tychicus, the 1,200 miles back to Colossae. They knocked on the door of Philemon. He opens the door. They hand him the letter. There's Onesimus, the runaway slave, with his knees knocking. He's shaking, not knowing what's going to happen. And I'm sure he said, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Philemon reads the letter. Let's read it again, verse 18 and 19. Paul says, but if he has wronged you, and I know he has, knows you anything, put that on my tab. Put that on my account. And then he says, I, Paul, am writing with my own hand. Usually Paul wrote with an amanuensis, his secretary. He just dictated. But he says, look, this is my own handwriting. I will repay. He says, I'm signing a promissory note. I'm going to pay for this. Now, isn't that amazing? Paul's bereft of any money. I mean, he's in prison. How's he going to pay? He doesn't have anything that we know of. Some of Ginger's family came and visited us last week from Oklahoma, her aunt and uncle, and her aunt was telling about their little granddaughter. She's just a little bitty thing, a toddler, that she said recently she got in the car and they were going somewhere and she was in the car seat and she spotted a little penny in the floorboard, and it was a new shiny penny. And so as she's getting out, she said, "Grandma, could I have that penny?" And she goes, "Sure, honey, you can have it." And she grabbed it and she was clutching it. She was so happy. She said, "Oh, Grandma, thank you. I was getting low on cash." She's still low on cash. Although I read this week that a penny is worth more than a penny. It's worth nearly 1.5 pennies of copper, but there's a huge fine if you melt it down for the copper. Same way with a nickel. But the Apostle Paul, he was getting low on cash. He's a prisoner, and yet he says, "I will pay." Have you ever had to pay a debt that you didn't feel like you owed? Do you know the U.S. Treasury has a public debt reduction fund that you can make a voluntary contribution to the national debt? There was a lady in Austin, Texas a few years ago by the name of Trudy Powell. 5 days after the April 15th filing deadline, she had paid so much tax and was so upset by the national debt that she went out to the mall and set up a booth, a table, collecting money for the national debt. There's a couple in Washington State that for years now, every year they send in an extra $400 on their tax return to voluntarily put it against the national debt. On any given year, there's generally over $2 million given to this fund. Now, I myself have never felt moved to contribute to this fund. I don't know if you have. Sometimes we look at the debt and we say, "I didn't really make that debt. It's not my fault." Apostle Paul looks at this debt that was created by Onesimus. It wasn't his fault. But he said, "You know what? I'm going to help reconcile it." Whenever there's a broken relationship, someone has to pay. And we always assume the one who did the wrong is the one that pays. But in forgiveness, it's the one who was wronged that releases the debt. There's another principle here. Forgiveness is a choice. Look what he says in Philemon, verse 14. "But without your consent, I want to do nothing, that your good deed might not be by compulsion, as it were, but voluntary." Apostle Paul says, "I wanted to keep Onesimus here, but you know what, Philemon, I really want you to have a choice in this, because forgiveness is a choice. I'm not going to command you to do this, because forgiveness is a choice that you make. You have to choose to forgive. You have to sacrifice your natural inclination. Our natural inclination is when we're pushed, we push back. When we're hit, we hit back. When we're wounded, we strike back. We want revenge. We want to get even. We want to settle the debt. But we have a choice. Verse 15. "For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever." He said, look, he left, but now you release him to receive him. I mean, Philemon, what are you going to let go? You're going to let go of a runaway, a thief, a cheat, and what are you going to get back? A brother, a friend, a servant. Often we live in misery, and we live what I believe is subpar because we will not release the past. I'm convinced there's people in this room or people listening by radio or television that there's something that's happened in your past that you won't release. And by the past, I don't mean it happened yesterday or even last week or last month. Something that happened a long, long, long time ago, and you've never released it. Did you know that forgiveness is a matter of choice? But it's also, forgiveness is a matter of obedience. Look in verse 21 at what he says to him. "Having confidence in your obedience, I write to you knowing that you'll do even more than I say." I'm telling you to receive him back, and I think you're going to do even more. You're probably going to free him. You're going to set him free. He says, because I know you're obedient. And he's not talking about obedience to Paul. He's talking about obedience to God. It is God that desires you to forgive. Sometimes people say, oh, I just can't forgive. You know what? Love finds a way. Don't ever say that. Don't ever say, I can't forgive. Say this, I won't forgive, because there's the truth. If you're a believer, God gives you the grace to release the hurts of life. Don't ever say, I can't. Say, I won't. Because love finds a way. You say, well, I just don't know how I can do it. Well, you know what? You ask God, and love will find a way. Look at verse 19. Paul says, I, Paul, am writing with my own hand. I will repay. Not to mention to you that you owe me even your own self besides, he says to Philemon. He said, here's the fact, Philemon. You forgive him because you've been forgiven. You owe your life to me, leading you to Christ, and more than that, you owe it to God. Isn't that the point? That we release other people because God has been gracious to us? That out of the grace that's extended to us, how dare we be stingy with grace that we extend to other people? Paul is such an optimist. Look how he concludes the book in verse 22. But meanwhile, also prepare a guest room for me, for I trust that through your prayers I shall be granted to you. The Apostle Paul writes Philemon, he says, I'm going to do my best to come where you're at. Now, he didn't. It was sometime after that they pulled him out of the house arrest, the rented house that he lived in, and they placed him in a dark, dank dungeon. Rat-infested, horrible, just a hole, a pit in the ground. We don't know how long he stayed in that pit. Eventually one day the soldiers came for him and they pulled him up out of that hole in the ground. Probably covered his eyes against the brilliance of the sun. Once again, he was shackled between soldiers. They took him outside of the city of Rome. He said a few words of farewell to Luke, who was there, and maybe Timothy. John Mark had arrived by now. And then he was beheaded. But I love the optimism of Paul. He says, prepare a little room for me because I'm going to do my best to come. Sometimes we think that we can just retire spiritually. Now, you may retire from work, but you don't retire spiritually. There's never a time where you just kind of coast in your Christian life. Paul, at the very end of his life, was still planning and still thinking about going on a missionary journey and still thinking what he could do for God. One last point. Forgiveness is a process. Oh, there's a point in time. There's a point where we surrender the hurt to God and ask for God's grace that we might release it. But that doesn't mean we're not going to take it up again, because it's a process. Sometimes it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward within our life. There's a hurt in our life. Someone has hurt us or embarrassed us. They've used us. They've betrayed us. And you know what? It takes time to heal. In fact, the deeper the wound, the more time it takes. But there's hope. Your family may be in an absolute mess. You may say, my family is dysfunctional. They're not even talking to each other. It can never be straightened out. Oh, yes, it could. That's the miracle of grace. Forgiveness can take place. You think, well, this situation will never be any different. There will always be hostility. There will always be anger between me and this other person. Not necessarily, but it may take time. We want everything instantly. We want instant coffee. We want instant tea. We even want instant weight loss. It doesn't happen that way. Relationships don't sour overnight, and they don't heal overnight. The whole book of Philemon, if you were to sit down and read it in one setting, you would discover that it's a wonderful, I think, a wonderful illustration of the gospel. It's a broken relationship between a man named Onesimus and a man named Philemon. And there's someone standing in the middle saying, hey, let's get these people together. Let's reconcile the master and the slave. Let's reconcile the one who was offended and the one who offended. The one who sinned and the one who was sinned against. Isn't that what Jesus does for us? Way back nearly at the dawn of recorded history, there was a man by the name of Job that lived. And he said in Job chapter 9, nor is there any mediator between us who may lay his hand on both of us. He's crying out to God, and he said, oh God, you're way up there, and I'm way down here. You're holy, and I'm a sinner. You're infinite, and I'm finite. And there's no one in between. What we need is a go-between. We need a mediator that can get me to you and get you to me. Isn't that what the life of Jesus is about? The advocate, the go-between. That's what the Apostle Paul did for Onesimus. He brought him and Philemon together. And we are like Onesimus. We have sinned. We're fugitives. We're on the lam, running from God so many times in our life, alienated, separated from God. We have a debt that we cannot pay, that's been created by our own behavior. And Jesus steps forward and says, you know what? I'm going to pay this debt for you. Let me ask you this question. Do you think it's harder to humble yourself and ask to be forgiven, or is it harder to forgive? Is it harder to be in the shoes of Onesimus, or is it harder to be in the shoes of Philemon? Which is the greater mark of maturity? The fact is, spiritually, it's easy to come to God. We have this debt that we've created, and yet God has settled that debt. And we repent, we turn from our sin, and we turn from depending upon ourselves, and we turn to God. And by faith, we appropriate what God has done for us, and we express that many times in prayer. We call upon the name of the Lord, and God forgives us. And sometimes we start thinking we're morally superior. We're spiritually superior. At least I had enough sense to call upon the name of the Lord, and I confess my sin. I've been forgiven. No, the greatest act of maturity is not to be forgiven. It is to forgive. I hope you enjoyed this series of messages on mending broken relationships. If you missed one of the messages, then you could call us or write us, and we'd be glad to send you the entire series. The Apostle Paul in the book of Philemon reconciles two men. That's really what Jesus does for us. God is holy. He's never sinned. We've all sinned. We've all blown it. But Jesus was sent to be the mediator, the go-between, the advocate, to bring us and God together. If that's never happened in your life, then you could call the number on the screen, and there's folks standing by that will pray with you, show you right out of the Word of God how you can be reconciled with God. We'd love to hear from you. Email us, write us, let us know how we can be a blessing to you. Then join us the same time next week for Today's Walk.
We hope you're finding this three-part series on mending broken relationships helpful in your spiritual walk. We know that you may have missed one of the messages or simply feel led to share it with a family member or a friend. Pastor Roger is offering all three of his Mending Broken Relationships messages on one DVD at no cost to you. Simply write to us at Today's Walk, 4800 Fruitvale Avenue, Bakersfield, California, or call our toll-free number at 800-382-3470. Our desire is to help you in your daily walk. So write to us or call us now to receive all three programs on one DVD. A caring person is waiting to talk with you right now about today's message. Call us at area code 661-393-5683 or toll free at 800-382-3470. You'll find our website to be a great resource too, with today's program available with video on demand. Or you can order a DVD copy of today's message and other helpful resources. Today's Walk is a broadcast ministry of Valley Baptist Church. When in Bakersfield, you're invited to join us for worship at 4800 Fruitvale Avenue, Sunday mornings at 9:15 or 11 a.m. Join us again next week at the same time for Today's Walk from Valley Baptist Church in Bakersfield, California.